second here while I also get the recording started on Zoom. All right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn on pollinators. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Felicity and I'm the program manager for FARRMS, which is a local nonprofit that supports sustainable agriculture and builds local food systems in North Dakota. Today's Lunch and Learn is all going to be all about pollinators. And we are also joined by our guest speaker, Sarah Hamilton Buxton. Sarah works with the Xerces Society to increase awareness of pollinator conservation by educating people on the importance of pollinators to our way of life. She holds a bachelor's degree in wildlife science and a master's degree in renewable energy resources with a concentration in wildlife science. So we are very excited to have you here today. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. Would you just quickly introduce yourself?
Sure, yes. First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone for joining and taking time out of your day to learn about pollinators. Like Felicity said, I'm Sarah Hamilton Buxton, and I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. A lot of folks in North Dakota might not have heard of us. I'm the only employee in the state, but we are nationwide. We're a small nonprofit, and I partner with NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a federal agency that works with private landowners to basically implement the Farm Bill. So I am lucky enough to be able to sit in the North Dakota state office, North Dakota NRCS state office, and I help those folks integrate pollinator conservation into our statewide NRCS specifications and standards and policy. But then also I get the privilege of working one-on-one with landowners, private landowners as well. And my position does cover all of North Dakota and Eastern Montana. So I do work with Montana NRCS and Montana private landowners as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone again for joining us. Again, this Lunch and Learn is going to go from noon to 1, so feel free to bring your lunch, join us wherever is most comfortable for you, and I'm going to go over a couple housekeeping items before we get started. We're going to start with a presentation from Sarah about pollinators, and I do encourage you guys to ask questions throughout the meeting. If you are joining us on Zoom, you can unmute and ask the question yourself or type it into the chat box if you feel more comfortable with that, and I will ask the question for you. We also have Stephanie Bloomhagen, who is the Executive Director of FARRMS with us, and she's going to be monitoring the comments in the Facebook live stream. So if you're joining us on Facebook, feel free to ask questions in there as well, and we'll try to get those answered as quick as we can. After our presentation from Sarah, we are going to be moving into a discussion and more questions. So this will be a little bit more informal. Feel free to unmute if you want to and just kind of delve into pollinators, the benefits of pollinators, and how you could maybe start to incorporate those into your farm or yard or garden. So that is everything I have. Sarah, if you are ready, then you can go ahead and share your screen.
Yep, I'm ready. Thanks, Felicity.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay. Are y'all seeing the presentation?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, well, again, thanks everyone for joining. I am Sarah Hamilton Buxton, and I'm an NRCS and Xerces partner pollinator biologist. Let's see. Okay, like Felicity said, please ask questions as we go. We want this to be, more of a discussion. I think that's the best way for folks to learn. So by no means is this some hard informal lecture. Please jump in with questions as I go along. I don't pretend to know all the answers, but if I don't know the answer, I will tell you as much, and I will follow up and try to get you that answer. Okay, so the importance of pollinators. Pollinators is certainly a term that's thrown around a lot these days, and it can be used in different ways, which can be confusing. Even natural resource professionals will sometimes use pollinators to mean the plants that pollinating insects use, or sometimes they can mean pollinators as the actual animals who are doing pollination. So I always like to start off with just let's take it back to the definition of pollination and kind of start from there so that we all are at least using the same terminology. So the definition of pollination is, or pollination occurs when pollen is moved from the male parts of a flower to the female parts of the flower. And that results in reproduction for that plant, which is often results in fruit and seed set for that plant. It's a really important service that we will get into in the following slides, but because plants can't move, they rely on either wind or animals to move their pollen for them. Some plants like grasses and corn are wind pollinated, but the large majority of terrestrial plants, more than 85% of these terrestrial flowering plants, require an animal to move pollen for them. There are some vertebrate pollinators such as hummingbirds or bats, but the overwhelming majority of pollinating animals are invertebrates, are insects. So it's really remarkable how important pollinators are to our daily life and our way of life. They're small and we easily overlook them. So it's really easy to take for granted all of the things that they do for us, starting with providing us with so many of our fruits and vegetables that are essential to our nutrition and to a healthy diet. So again, as pollinators are moving pollen around, they are enabling plants to produce fruits and seeds. We then consume those fruits and vegetables that gives us essential vitamins and minerals. A lot of the vitamins and minerals and the fruits and vegetables that we need are pollinator dependent crops. We simply wouldn't have those fruits and vegetables if it weren't for our pollinators. Put it into numerical terms, about 35% of worldwide crop production requires pollinators. And to zoom into just the US alone, put it into dollar amounts, our pollinator crops in this country alone generate $18 to $27 billion annually in value. So they're really important, no matter how you look at it. If you're looking from a human nutrition standpoint or even a financial standpoint, they're really crucial animals. I think, though, a picture is worth 1,000 words in this scenario. So here's a picture of the produce section that we are all accustomed to walking into and enjoying. We have lots of options, lots of color even. And not only do we have a lot of options, but we have a large quantity of those options. But if pollinators were to blink out overnight, this is what our produce section is left with. You can see just the tremendous amount of fruits and vegetables that we would lose. Things like raspberries, strawberries, blueberries, eggplant, pumpkins, squash, avocado, the list goes on and on. Our tea and coffee, which is not in the produce section, but also is pollinator dependent, chocolate even. So a lot of the things that we all really cherish and love require pollinators. Another part of the grocery store that you might not think is impacted by pollinators is the dairy aisle. You might think, what in the world? How are pollinators impacting our cattle? Well, our dairy cows rely or are often fed alfalfa and other legumes. Well, alfalfa is a pollinator dependent plant. So without pollinators, again, if we were to imagine them blinking out overnight, our dairy section goes from looking like this with lots of options, lots of quantity of each option, to something more like this. So if pollinators go away overnight, not only is the quantity of milk and dairy products impacted, but also the variety, flavorings that we are so used to having in our yogurts, like vanilla, again, those berries, raspberries, blackberries, strawberry, blueberry, chocolate, the list goes on. Those are all going away if pollinators go away. So our dairy aisle is even impacted by pollinators. A way to summarize this is that about 1 in every 3 bites of food and drink require the presence of a pollinator. So then if we go beyond just us humans, pollinators are also essential to ecosystem health. Like I mentioned, about 85% or a little more of our terrestrial plant species require pollinators to reproduce, to continue to propagate out on the landscape. So our natural ecosystems really need our pollinators so that these plants can continue to live on. The longevity and diversity of our native and restored plant communities really needs healthy and diverse pollinator communities. And that's when I say pollinator, I mean pollinating insect communities. Also, pollinators are valuable for other wildlife species. The fruit and seeds that result from pollination are a major part of the diet of many birds and mammals. The pollinators, the insects themselves, are also food for wildlife, including up to 89% of birds. And also, pollinator habitat is absolutely other wildlife habitat. One of the main species that comes to mind here in North Dakota is pheasants. Although pheasant is not a native species to North Dakota, they're certainly an important species to North Dakota from a hunting standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, and from an economic standpoint. And pollinator habitat is wonderful brood habitat for our ringneck pheasant, along with plenty of other, many other native wildlife species. So you might wonder, okay, who are these pollinating insects that she's talking about? And the insect world is incredibly diverse. Well, the invertebrate world is incredibly diverse. And then if you zoom into the insect world, we're still talking about an incredible number of different species. So I like to break pollinators down into just 6 main groups, understanding that there's a tremendous amount of diversity within each of these 6 groups. So bees, wasps, flies, beetles, butterflies, and moths are the 6 main pollinating insect groups. And of those 6 groups, by far and away, our bees are the most efficient and effective pollinators. They're just really built for pollination. Their bodies are good and hairy. They collect pollen efficiently, and they move it around really well. What's surprising to folks, and me as well, when I was learning about the pollination world, is that we have a tremendous number of native wild bees in the US alone, nearly 3,600 species. And then if you throw in Canada and Mexico, we're talking about 5,000 species of native wild bees in North America alone. So these are just a few pictures here to demonstrate the diversity within this group. But we are talking about far more than just the honeybee, which I think is the one we're all most familiar with. Talking bumblebees, sweat bees, cuckoo bees, the list really goes on and on. One thing I always like to mention, I think, is a little known fact that our honeybees, as much as we love them and their honey, are actually not native to the US. They've been here for so long, and we all are so familiar with them that it's easy to think that they are, but they're actually not. They are a European species, and they were introduced to North America in the 1620s. And that date probably rings a bell with you. When the European settlers came over to the New World, they wanted their honey, so they brought their honeybees with them. So I like to think of honeybees and give the analogy to folks, especially here in the Northern Great Plains, that our honeybees are to our native wild bees like chickens are to our native grouse species. They are a domesticated species. They are managed by humans, and we breed them for disease and pesticide resistance. But honeybees are, again, not only important to all of us because they give us delicious honey, but they're really important to North Dakota. This picture here on the this picture here is a very familiar scene to all of us here in North Dakota in the summer months. Well, oops, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, y'all. The reason for that is that more than 65% of the honeybee hives in the US are brought to the North Central Plains in the summer months. You might wonder, okay, in the summer months they're up here. Well, where do they go in the spring, fall, and winter? Most of them, the large majority of them, go down to California. Why? Because they're used to help pollinate specialty crops. By and large, they're being used to help pollinate the almond crops down in California. So beekeepers go to a lot of effort to load up their hives and truck them up to the Northern Great Plains so that in the summer months, so that their bees can rest and recharge and recover from the poor nutrition and pesticide exposure that they undergo in the almond groves and while pollinating specialty crops. As you can imagine, when they're down there doing pollination services, they're certainly working hard and getting exposed to a lot of different things that can be hard on them. So beekeepers love to bring them up to the northern Great Plains where they can kind of, again, rest and recharge. Again, pollinators are something that we're hearing more and more about. They're in the media a lot these days, and there's good reason for that. There is overwhelming evidence that both our managed pollinators, so our honeybees, and our wild pollinators are declining. Scientists are still trying to figure out and nail down the exact reasons as to why. We have some ideas, but regardless of the reason why, there's overwhelming evidence and everyone agrees that we are losing our pollinators at a pretty accelerated rate. So some of the threats to pollinators, some of the reasons why this is happening are multifaceted and complex. Like most ecological issues, it's never just a silver bullet or one answer. There's many reasons why these animals are declining. One reason being habitat loss, which comes in many forms. Urbanization results in habitat loss, grasslands being converted to cropland, and then also even on a smaller scale, the removal of field windbreaks to enlarge crop fields. You know, we've all seen windbreaks getting ripped out in order to enlarge those crop fields around the state, and that is, believe it or not, can be important habitat for our pollinators. Pesticide use is another threat to our pollinators. We use pesticides for a lot of things. Mosquito control. We use pesticides in our homes and gardens, in our yards, and then also in our agricultural systems. Disease, disease spreading throughout our pollinators in both our honeybees and in our wild bees are impacting their numbers as well. And especially as we do move bees and butterflies around, more bees, when we move bees around, like I just showed in the previous slide, that's a great way to also move disease around the country as well. And then also invasive species. As introduced plants degrade our native plant communities, that impacts pollinators. Kentucky bluegrass is one that really comes to mind for me as a biologist. It's invading our native rangelands tremendously, and we're losing biodiversity on our rangelands as a result of that. And that certainly can impact pollinators. So because of this decline in pollinator populations, there's been a recent emphasis on creating and enhancing pollinator habitat on the landscape. And this really came into play with the 2008 Farm Bill, because that was the first farm bill to include pollinator conservation. You might wonder, what is pollinator conservation and what does it really entail? Well, basically just providing habitat for these pollinating insects. And habitat is really pretty simple. They need flowers as food. They need shelter for nesting and overwintering. And then they need refuge from pesticides. If we create this habitat, we have to be careful and cognizant of not exposing that area to pesticides where it's going to kill these animals that we have worked so hard to bring into that area. So what parts of the flower specifically are pollinators using? Well, first of all, they need blooming flowers throughout the growing season. So we want to have species that are blooming in the early, mid, and late part of the season to provide pollen and nectar to these animals. They use that pollen and nectar to feed themselves and their young. They need pollen as a protein source. So think of that as like their juicy steaks. And then they need nectar as their carbohydrate source, or think of that as like their, their sugars and their breads, if you will. And in order to support native pollinators, it's best to plant native flowers and grasses whenever possible. Those are the plants that these pollinators have adapted to, and so that's the best plants to provide them with the best pollen and nectar sources. I love this to talk about shelter for nesting and overwintering because it's so simple, and these are things that I am willing to bet you probably already have on your operation. So our ground nesting bees need bare ground that occurs naturally between bunch grasses, on hilltops, and on slopes. So this picture in the bottom left here might look at first glance like an ant hill, but it is not. It is actually the work of a ground nesting bee. Rock and brush piles. This is something that we have no shortage of in North Dakota, but you might not think of it. You might think of it as just wasted space, but actually it's providing good overwintering habitat and shelter for our pollinators. Bunch grasses, again, that's something that North Dakota has a lot of options for with bunch grasses. They occur naturally around the state. So you probably already have that element on your operation. And then woody and pithy stems are important for our stem nesting bees. Oh, excuse me, let me back up. Bunch grasses are, you might wonder why that's important. Well, that structure of the grass provides important nesting habitat for some of our bumblebees. And then woody and pithy stems can provide habitat for our stem nesting bees. So this picture on the bottom right is a picture of purple coneflower, or some folks might call it black Samson, or we also might call it echinacea. It is a native flower that you have most likely seen throughout the state. And once it grows for the summer and it starts to senesce and that flower stem dries out, a lot of times the cone of the old flower head will get knocked off. And if you happen to see that next time you're walking around, you'll notice that that stem is actually hollow inside. Well, that is perfect habitat for our stem nesting bees. But again, it's something that's so easily overlooked because we're so used to thinking of animals that are bigger than these really small stem nesting bees. Might also think, okay, this all sounds good in theory, but really, how much are these pollinating insects actually contributing to yields? Great question. Researchers, scientists put pen to paper to answer that exact question. And there's lots of different crops that they looked at, but I chose this study because canola is a crop that we have here in North Dakota. And the research found that canola yields were indeed boosted by native pollinators when producers provided pollinator habitat on their farms. So we're not talking about a producer having to truck in honeybees to boost their canola yields. We're actually talking about native pollinators, insects that already live here in North Dakota, helping boost yields on the farm. So the farmer's bottom line was improved by simply providing the things that we just talked about: food, shelter, and protection from pesticides. And they were able to do that through practices that, again, already probably are happening on your operation. Things like leaving field breaks and windrows, planting flowering plants, and providing shelter, such as rock piles and woody debris. So to think, kind of narrow in a little bit, that's why pollinators are important, not only to us as humans, but also to farmers and ranchers. How can I take that information and do something on my own operation? Well, I like this picture because it's a picture, kind of zoomed in. It's like right there around the farmhouse, but there's a lot of opportunity to provide pollinator habitat, even in a small space. These are small animals. They don't need a ton of space for you to be able to provide habitat for them. Like I said, I'm willing to bet you've probably already got some of these habitat elements on your operation already. Things like flowering trees and shrub rows. Dakota's a windy state, and so all of us really value our wind protection, our trees and shrub rows. A lot of times we already have flowering species in those windbreaks and trees and shrub rows. If we don't, that's an element that you could consider adding to your windbreaks. Understory plantings, so meaning understory plantings within those tree and shrub rows that would flower and provide forage for our pollinators. Field borders, pollinator insectary strips. That's something that maybe isn't as much of a common practice in North Dakota. That's generally used when you're putting pollinator habitat, so native flowers and grasses, in strips amongst your crop fields. Cover crops, that's a really common practice here in North Dakota. If you have flowering cover crops that you allow to bloom, then that's some great pollinator habitat for these animals. Beetle banks, that's not as common of a practice in North Dakota, but believe it or not, I do have a producer who has a beetle bank on his land. So it is something that is done here in North Dakota. Filter strips, pivot corners, any odd areas that you can't get equipment into, or that just kind of you would like to enhance, could be great areas for pollinator habitat. And then also it's important, like I mentioned, when we're creating pollinator habitat to consider pesticide refuge from pesticides. So, if you're not an organic producer, if you're using pesticide on your operation, we need to think about drift protection, ways that we can protect that habitat from drift. I also want to mention that pollinator plantings can be incorporated in and around high tunnels. So if you are, working on a small farm, small operation, and you have a high tunnel, number one, there might be some crops in that high tunnel that pollinators that might even be pollinator dependent crops, or that pollinators would love to forage on. So don't think, oh, it's in an enclosed area, I can't benefit from pollinator habitat. That's not true. Certainly incorporating pollinator habitat as close as you can to that high tunnel, and then obviously leaving the doors open at times so that the pollinators can get in and out is beneficial.
Sarah, can you quickly go back and explain what a beetle bank is?
Yes, great question. And thanks for jumping in. So a beetle bank is hold on, I'm trying to think about where to start. Okay, so we have beetles, predatory beetles, that can provide two things for us humans. They can help control pest populations, so insect pest populations, and they also can feed on weed seed. So for instance, the producer that I've worked with on a beetle bank, he's an organic producer, and your crops as you can. And then you put native bunch grasses and native flowers, but bunch grasses you seed that onto the beetle bank or onto that berm. And that provides really good habitat for those predatory beetles that can then provide some pest control ecosystem services for you, or some pest control services for you. Does that help?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I have one more kind of related question on this. And
Sure.
so as we're trying to create habitat, both like overwinter habitat and then habitat during the summer for pollinators, is there like a chance that you could be attracting unwanted insects or pests onto your farm that will end up causing a problem, or will the native pollinators kind of outcompete those? I don't know. Is that an issue or a concern that producers have brought up to you?
That is a good question that, yes, certainly I've been asked before. And the short answer is no. And I totally understand that concern. And also folks might worry about like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be introducing potentially weedy species onto my operation. And we will get into that in a few minutes. But so weed species is something, if you're talking plants, weed species are something that you need to control when you're establishing pollinator habitat. But getting into inviting pest invertebrate species, that's a great question. Pollinator habitat, and this is a whole nother, like, could be a day-long topic. Pollinator habitat is also great beneficial insect habitat. So when you are creating pollinator habitat, you're not only creating a good home for our pollinators, but also for beneficial insects who are natural enemies or predators and parasitoids of some pest species, or of a lot of our pest species. So in fact, you would be inviting natural enemies in that would help control pest populations. However, like I said, that's a whole day-long topic, and you do have to consider refuge from pesticides in those situations as well. But the short answer is no, don't worry too much about inviting unwanted invertebrates into your operation via your pollinator habitat.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer the question? Any follow-up questions from that? Those were good questions.
I'll jump back in if I see anything else in the chat.
Okay, good. I had lost connection. Okay, well, I will move along then. Okay, so we talked about high tunnels and how pollinator habitat can be helpful for those scenarios as well. And then the other thing I really like to point out is that habitat can be multifunctional, which is actually just getting at the question about pest species as well. So perfect timing. This, just to give you some context of what you're looking at here, this is a pollinator strip or an insectary strip that is on a farm, an organic farm in central Montana. So it's actually an even more arid environment than what we have here in North Dakota, yet they were able to establish good pollinator habitats. So you have, the pollinator habitat, about 20 native flowers and grasses growing in the insectary strip. And you have another strip over here, but then they have their organic crops here. So not only are these strips providing pollinator habitat, as indicated here, this is a bumblebee, it's not just a black dot. They're inviting pollinators in to help boost their crop yields, but it's providing a lot of other functions for them. They have, again, because they're organic producers, they are using these as a weed buffer for active cropland, help capture weed seed. They also have seen that they are getting reduced wind reduction. As the wind whips across their crop fields, it hits these nice tall, wind tolerant, drought tolerant plants and helps reduce wind. It provides corridors for wildlife to move throughout their farm. It reduces, this is a big one, reduces overland runoff and snow melt. So it helps capture moisture and keep it on their ground. And then also it is providing habitat for beneficial insects for pest control. So they're getting some pest control services out of this habitat as well. So you might say that's all fine and good, but where in the world do I start? So again, this could be an hour-long presentation. I'm just really hitting the high points. And then after I'm done talking about this, I will provide some follow-up places where if you are interested in doing this on your operation, you could talk to local NRCS folks, or I've got some Xerces resources for you as well. Okay, so there's 5 phases: site selection and evaluation, planning and design, site prep, plant establishment, and then long-term management. I'm just briefly going to touch on each of those. So locating habitat, I feel like a broken record, and I apologize if it sounds like that on your end, but it's really important to consider where you're going to place pollinator habitat and how you're going to protect it from pesticides. The closer you can get it to your crops, the better, because pollinators are going to have more easy access to those crops. However, placement near crops is not an option if the risk of pesticide exposure exists. Because again, you don't want to spend all this time and effort and money creating habitat, bringing these pollinators onto your operation just for them to accidentally get killed by spray, or even just using herbicide if that's going to kill the broadleafs or some of the native plants that you've worked hard to get established. Also, it's important to consider location of habitat from a soil type as well. It might be really tempting to think, oh, we've got this really poor ground that not much grows there. That would be a great place to put pollinator habitat. Well, the problem with that is that a lot of times those are saline spots, or they're just tough soils where not many native plants are going to grow there either. So it seems good in theory until you start to look at the really short list of plants that would actually thrive in those soils. And so that's not the best place for pollinator habitat either. Okay, phase 2, the planning and design. I like to show this to folks just to kind of manage expectations. It's so easy to, of course, this is September still, but it's easy to be thinking in the spring, like, oh man, this pollinator habitat sounds like something I want to dive into, so I'm going to get something planted this year. I get those calls every spring from producers who are excited to get started right away. And when in fact, it really is, you need to dedicate an entire growing season at least to site preparation. So consider your timeline. If we're thinking now about where you could place pollinator habitat, know right off the bat that it's probably going to be an entire growing season of 2022 of site preparation. And then seeding, I do recommend generally a springtime seeding. Seeding would happen that following spring, so 2023. Budget is also something to consider. Our native flowers are not the cheapest seed that you've ever bought. I can tell you that right now. So it's something that is, there's some money involved in that. They don't have to break the bank by any means. It depends on how many flowers you want. But budget is something that has to be considered, absolutely. Plant selection. Even if you have a favorite flower or favorite grass that you would love to plant, if it's not suitable to the soil type that you're planning on planting into, we just can't use it. So that's something else to consider. And then seed source is also important. Again, pollinators are gaining more and more attention, and I've had very kind and considerate relatives send me pollinator seed from like Colorado that they saw in the store, or even sometimes if you see pollinator mixes being sold at like local box stores, might be tempting to buy that, but a lot of times, so for instance, in the scenario of seed being sent to me from Colorado, well, there's going to be a lot of flowers that grow in Colorado that wouldn't grow up here in North Dakota. And even sometimes seed that's bought in local stores here might have a lot of different flowering species and grasses that just don't grow in North Dakota. Also, you need to be careful to not buy treated seed. Sometimes, not as much probably in the native plant world as in maybe some of our crop seeds, but sometimes seeds can be treated with insecticide. For instance, I know going to local nurseries, I've asked like, hey, has this plant been planted or treated with nicotinoid or any kind of pesticide? And they often just don't know because they weren't the growers. So those are questions that you don't necessarily think about off the bat, but that are actually pretty important. Site preparation. Okay, so this is the most important phase because we want to do our best to eradicate weeds so that we can have a successful establishment and reduce competition once we do actually plant. So there's many different ways to prepare a site. Most commonly used in North Dakota is using herbicide, and it depends on what type of vegetation you're planting into. If you're planting into an old crop field, you might not have to work as hard on site preparation as if you were planting into like lawn, typically Kentucky blue and brome up here. Those are two really tough species to kill. So it just depends on the specifics of your site, but herbicide is one option. And then in case there's any organic producers on the call, we certainly have organic methods as well. And Xerces does have a resource for ways to help you get a site prepared without the use of herbicide. And so this picture on the bottom left is one example of an organic method. This is solarization. It's basically, the whole idea behind it is using a clear tarp. You lay that tarp down for an entire growing season. Make sure that the wind doesn't pick it up and blow it away, which is no small feat, I know, here in North Dakota. And what that does is the sun just bakes the ground underneath it and kills off the existing vegetation and also weed seeds that are in that area.
I have one more question for you, Sarah.
Great.
Is there a danger of introducing invasive weed species into your, so if you get a pollinator mix, is there a chance that that might have invasive weed species, especially if you go through all this work to prep your site? Is that something that you see happening or a danger?
Like super, super rarely. No, I would say that is not a general concern, especially because you would want to get a seed mix that is tailored to your soil type so that you are putting seed in the ground that will actually grow in that area. So in doing that, you generally go through a seed house, like, seed houses that we would have here in the state or in the region. So in doing that, no, I don't worry about there being weed seed. However, that might become more of a concern if you're buying like pre-packaged, pollinator mixes. That might be more of a concern. So that's why I really recommend, for a number of reasons, doing site-specific planning, site-specific seed mixes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, phase 4, plant establishment. There's two ways to get pollinator habitat established. You can either do it from seeds, or you can do it via transplants or plugs. And then if we're talking seeds, you could either do it broadcasting, depends on how big the area is, you could broadcast by hand, or maybe like using a belly grinder, kind of like a hand cranked broadcaster, or you could do it mechanically with a broadcaster. Or what I see a lot of times in North Dakota is with a grass drill. And it depends on what kind of habitat you're going for as to whether or not you would choose seeds or transplants. If you wanted to do just kind of a field or a meadow of pollinator habitat, I would recommend seeds. Same for fill borders, insectary strips, filter strips, and understory plantings. The other thing about seeds is that typically that planting isn't watered. It just receives the moisture that we get that year and subsequent years. Whereas transplants, you would want to use transplants or plugs if you are trying to establish a tree and shrub row or windbreaks. And then a lot of times you do need to water those areas. The important thing, let me back up, with broadcasting is that you want to make sure you get good seed to soil contact. So whether you're spreading it by hand or mechanically, it's important to use a roller packer or something to help make sure you get that good seed to soil contact. The habitat management, it's so nice to think that you can just plant via seeds or transplant, either one, pollinator habitat, and then walk away. These are native, drought-tolerant plants. They should be good to go, right? Well, not quite. The establishment phase is a time that needs a lot of attention on these pollinator plantings. Why? Because weed management in these early years is so important, because you have both broadleafs, our wildflowers, or our forbs, same thing, and grasses in these plantings. So that really eliminates a lot of herbicide options. And certainly you couldn't just go and spray blanketly the entire plot. You would, if you do choose to use herbicides to control weeds, you would need to spot spray. So from the get-go, it's tough to use herbicides. So that's why we want to get weed management under control, first of all, in the site prep stage, and then once it's planted, really stay on top of it in that first year. And the best way to do that is to mow. So the picture on the top right here is a picture in June. This is weedy annuals are coming in, and you're going to get weedy annuals without a doubt. Whenever you disturb the soil type, you're going to disturb the soil, you're going to get annual weeds coming in. What's important is to control the seeds of those annual weeds. So if we can go in and mow before those weedy annuals set seed, then they will be controlled. You know, they'll go out of the planting that next year. So in June, we have weedy seed that's about to get set. You go in and you mow, and then the bottom right picture is a picture of July, and that does two things. It eliminated the seed that was growing on those weeds, and it also opened up the canopy for other desirable species that have been planted to grow and to get more light and moisture. So I do recommend first year mowing, and then also hand weeding. Depends on the size of your plot, but that could be an option. Weed whacking can also be a good option. I know I've worked with some people who are so excited to have the flowers growing that they wanted, that they don't want to mow the entire plot. And so it's totally their choice. If they would like to just weed whack instead of mowing the entire thing, then that's certainly an option. Like I said, spot herbicide treatment is an option, but we have to be really careful with that. We always want to be conscientious of which chemical we're using, so selective herbicide treatments. And then also, if, you know, year 2 or so in the planting, you see, oh, this spot isn't really growing as much, you can certainly, I would just recommend hand spreading, hand broadcasting those areas that seem to need a little bit more help. And then long term, if you're talking year 5, 6, 7 of the planting, it is important to do some type of management, because what will happen is that the grasses will tend to take over and the wildflowers will go out of the planting. So it needs some type of disturbance, either grazing or haying and or burning. All of these are good options to help keep the diversity of the planting intact. So this is, like I said, just barely scratching the surface of ways to create pollinator habitat. And you might think, oh my gosh, this is a lot, and if I'm interested in this, I'm going to need help. And that's absolutely perfectly okay and normal. And the good news is that NRCS has some Farm Bill programs that you can apply to for financial assistance. So NRCS has Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or what we call EQIP. And that, again, is one program where you can apply to it. And if your application is selected for financial assistance, then you can get some financial assistance to establish pollinator habitat. And those contract lengths average from 1 to 6 years, but can go as long as 10 years. Then we also have the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP. That's an NRCS program, and that contract length is 5 years. And again, there's pollinator practices within that program. And then also the Farm Service Agency, or FSA, offers Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. Again, it has pollinator practices included as some of the options under that program, and that contract length is anywhere from 10 to 15 years. So there are options for you to, like I said, apply for financial assistance, and if rewarded, you can certainly use that to go towards your pollinator habitat. However, if you're not interested in applying for Farm Bill programs, but you just want some technical assistance, NRCS that's what we do. So you are welcome to walk into any of our field offices, and we will help you. You don't need to sign a contract at all. If you just want to talk to someone about some technical assistance and some advice, that is certainly an available option as well. So on that note, I wanted to provide a number of links. Here are, in case folks don't know where their NRCS office is located, we have an NRCS office in like almost every county in the state. I think there's like 1 or 2 counties out west that maybe share one office. But you can go to these 2 links. One is for Eastern North Dakota, the other is for Western North Dakota, and find the field office that is nearest you. And then also the North Dakota NRCS Pollinator Fact Sheet is available here. That is it's just a good beginning resource of, why pollinators are important, a lot about what we talked about today, and then it gives some species of early, mid, and late blooming flowers as some ideas, just to maybe start getting you brainstorming if you're interested in this idea. And again, if you do choose to apply through Farm Bill programs and are awarded a Farm Bill or a NRCS contract, there's a lot of standards and specifications that we will give you and guidelines that you would need to follow. So that's the NRCS option. The other option is if you just wanted to do something on your own, Xerces has resources available here. Now, please let me be clear that these resources are not North Dakota NRCS standards and specifications. So these would be things that you would do just on your own, not under the umbrella of an NRCS contract. But there's still some good resources for you. They're also written more generally. A lot of these are regional resources, so they might not be North Dakota specific. But Farming for Pollinators, again, located at that link, is just kind of a good general introduction. A lot of the material we discussed today is in that one. Establishing Pollinator Meadows from Seed is another place to give you some good ideas. If you're an organic producer and you're interested in organic site preparation methods, that fact sheet is listed there. Again, that can be a topic that takes, it's could be a topic to really dive into, and I barely even mentioned it. So that's why I wanted to provide that resource for y'all. And then lastly, the Midwest Habitat Installation Guide. That, again, is something if you're wanting to do some habitat creation on your own. However, it's more for like the Minnesota, Iowa area. It's not as much for North Dakota, but I thought I would still provide it in case it gave people a jumping off place. And so with that, that is it. And I'm happy to take any other questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. I definitely learned a lot today, and I do have questions. I'll start off with one right away, but I want to encourage everyone else to jump in either in the chat, or if you're with us on Zoom, feel free to unmute. But my first question was geared toward people who, well, me, for example, I have a small backyard. I have a couple, like, tomato plants, herbs, that type of thing. But I am definitely not a producer by any means. Is there something I can do in my own yard to increase pollinator habitat and even, help my little vegetable plot that I have?
Yes, absolutely. The same principles can be applied large scale or small scale. So I too I have a backyard and I've planted native plants there. And it's really cool to see the diversity of pollinating insects that you can bring into, again, even a small space. And that's what I think is so cool about pollinator conservation is as a biologist, it's easy to think about, oh, well, these large mammals that we're all used to hearing about, need conservation, they need our help, and they need large acreages. Well, that's not the case with pollinators. So places like small backyards actually can help these animals out. And certainly by planting flowers that are going to attract pollinators to your backyard and to your vegetable garden will only help your vegetable garden. So yes, you could do that, Felicity. And the answer is planting native forbs, and so native flowers, and native grasses. And yeah, that brush pile, like, it might be so tempting. I think it is tempting for all of us to, in the fall, collect all the sticks that have fallen, collect whatever leaf litter might have fallen into your yard if you have trees or if you have neighboring trees, and take those, pile them up and throw them away. Actually, that's great overwintering habitat for these animals. So if you can, we have a slogan almost at Xerces called "Leave the Leaves." If you can stand to leave the leaves, that provides really important overwintering habitat. So again, even in backyards, you can absolutely provide pollinator habitat. And there's an entire program within Xerces for urban pollinator conservation. So yes, it is certainly a way to contribute to pollinators and to enhance your vegetable garden.
Okay, and going back to some of our producers who are already juggling a lot of different things, and I know you touched on like the benefits of pollinators at the beginning, but um, what words of encouragement would you have to a farmer who's interested in providing pollinator habitat on their farm, but it just seems um, like not manageable, or they wouldn't see the benefits of it right away, and it seems like more of a headache than it's worth? Like, what would you say to them?
Absolutely. First of all, like, I completely understand that mentality. And my first thought would be start small and start in a way that is going to be encouraging to you. So, if you've got a tree row or a windbreak that's kind of getting, it's aging and it could use some renovation. Well, if you would like to apply for financial assistance, NRCS can help with, we have a whole practice dedicated to tree row renovations, and you could put some flowering trees and shrubs in there. So it's a double whammy. It's first of all helping you protect your farmstead, cattle, whatever it may be, structures from the wind and capturing snow, but it also is providing pollinator habitat. So again, that's why I love the fact that habitat is multifunctional. It can help producers as well, like us humans, and pollinators. So that's a great place to start. And again, so many of us already have some type of tree row on our property. So start small. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it is overwhelming. I mean, even just starting in backyard sometimes can be really overwhelming. So, choose one species and plant that in your backyard. Or likewise, if you're on your operation, I understand that everybody is already juggling a lot. So let's not add one more thing to it. But if there's something that already does, like I said, maybe needs a little bit of maintenance, tree rows just come to mind because they're so needed for us here in North Dakota, needed for us people, but also can be a great way to, kind of two birds, one stone. Put in some new species that are flowering. But the same thing would also transfer to like the high tunnel scenario. No, if it's an overwhelming thought to think about creating this meadow of pollinator habitat, that's completely understandable. Just get a few flowers, even like sunflowers. Stiff sunflower is one that comes to mind. It's a beautiful flower. Well, and I'm staring at it, which is maybe why it comes to mind. But in this picture, but that's one that you could plant just right around the high tunnel. It's a pretty flower. Hopefully, maybe it would be a cheerful thing to add to your high tunnel area, but it's also tremendous the amount of pollinators that you can get coming to those flowers in the fall. So start small, I guess, is my overall advice there, because it is overwhelming and it can be too much, and then you give up before you even start, and that's discouraging. So I would say start small.
Okay, is there a website or resource that can help locate the best species to plant for like a specific location and soil type in North Dakota? Like, where would we go to get those questions answered?
Great question. And I could provide you with North Dakota NRCS tables and specifications, and that is really a burdensome document to give someone. So I would say, like, your eyes would glaze over as soon as I send it to you. So I would say go into your NRCS office, and if you don't even want to make the trip in, just give them a call, and they will be able to pull up, if you're able to describe, like here, and oftentimes we use legal descriptions. If you can give them the legal description of the area that you're thinking of, they can pull that soil type up on the computer and get you started and give you a list of species that are suitable for that soil type. And then if you would also want them to come out and do some digging just to confirm soil types, that's always great too, but that's a good starting place. So, and again, that North Dakota pollinator fact sheet here will provide you with an idea of the different flower options, but that's not soil type specific. So I would say the easiest thing is to call your NRCS office.
Great. I have another question that I just kind of thought of at the beginning of your talk. So you mentioned that pollinator habitat is also habitat for birds and other wildlife. Do you, it's kind of off topic, but do those other animals play a part in pollination as well? Like, do they support each other and the ecosystem, or do they not really get involved with pollination?
Great question. Probably like the birds, perhaps, or what you're thinking that would come into the
Yeah.
habitat. No, I mean, there's not, like I said, hummingbirds are the main ones that are pollinating animals. And that's just because of the way that they feed. So no, probably birds aren't birds aren't providing a tremendous amount of pollination services. However, I mean, they're essential to the ecosystem. So absolutely. For instance, I've had birds even in my yard feeding on native plants, blazing star or gay feather. That's what we call it sometimes too. I was shocked to see them coming in and feeding on seeds in the pollinator area of my yard. So it certainly provides value. And that's not even the bird feeding on the pollinating insects. That was the bird feeding on the seeds from my plants. So it certainly provides bird habitat, but no, birds aren't, except for hummingbirds, we generally don't consider them pollinators.
Is there any other questions?
This is Stephanie. Excuse me. I just wanted to clarify a point. Back at the beginning, you showed that wonderful illustration from Whole Foods of the produce varieties that would be lost, or the amount of produce that we would not have access to without pollinators. That was meant to show quantities, right? That wasn't meant to imply that oranges and tomatoes are not pollinated, correct?
Well, great question. It was meant to show quantities and species. So tomatoes do, so we humans have tinkered with tomatoes to where, yes, tomatoes benefit, especially from this cool thing called buzz pollination, where specific bumblebees are really efficient with the certain rhythm at which they beat their wings, are really efficient at knocking loose the pollen from tomato plants and enhancing the pollination of the tomato plant and therefore the yields of that plant. However, there are some tomato species that can self-pollinate. So that's probably why I was not involved in taking that picture, Stephanie, at Whole Foods, but that's a great question. That's probably why tomatoes were left in that picture. So it gets a little tricky, but for the most part, no, it was meant to just demonstrate both quantity and then also a lot of the other species. So the big species that jumped out to me that were lost were our berries, the apples and the raspberries, the blueberries, strawberries. Those plants are without question pollinator dependent, along with many others. But I think you picked up on a really great detail of where it gets a little bit tricky, because we've kind of tinkered with these plants and made some of them self-pollinating. But even those self-pollinating, like I said, tomatoes, which can be self-pollinating, really do benefit from pollinators. So great question. And Wei, you're a keen observer. Good question. Thanks, Stephanie. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
It might not be the answer you wanted, but yeah, that's a great question.
Well, that is everything I have. Again, thank you so much, Sarah. This was a great presentation, and I really learned a lot about pollinators, and I hope everyone else did as well. I will get a hold of some of these resources that you have here and make sure that we have those posted for everyone. And feel free to contact me at FARRMS for any questions. Okay,
Yes,
all right.
absolutely. And y'all are welcome to contact me as well. So.
Okay, well, everyone have a good afternoon, and I will see you all at some point in the future.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks for having me.
Thank you.